Hello, and welcome to the Rosewood Institute webinar series, Sexual Addiction, Is It Real? My name is Nancy Berry. I am the Marketing Manager for the Rosewood Centers for Eating Disorders. Joining me in the studio today is Michael Klinkner, Clinical Director of the Rosewood Center for Eating Disorders Outpatient Program. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Nancy. What I'm going to talk about today and walk you through is sexual addictions. There's the topic of the presentation is it real? There's still a lot of ongoing debate about whether or not this is a real problem. Is there real treatment? Is it something we should even be looking at or looking into? So I'm going to talk to you today and hopefully convince you about that it is absolutely real. These things take place. And we should look at this as any other behavioral type of addiction because it operates in just the same way. So here's what we're going to be doing today. First off, I'm going to help define what sexual addiction is. We're going to talk about what happens in males' brains because there's a big difference in males and females' brains. We're going to talk about the differences between sexual addiction and sexual offending because they're definitely not the same thing. And then we're going to talk some about the treatment of sexual addiction. Do's and don'ts, what's helpful, and what we know at this point. Let's get started. So on August 15th, 2011, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, most of us know that by ASAM, issued a public statement defining all addictions. Now this is all addictions, and that's going to be including sex addictions in terms of brain changes. It's not about behaviors. It's not about what you do. It is about what goes on within the brain. And this is a quote from them. This is, addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. So what that means is the primary, so it's the biggest, it's a big giant problem, chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. So it is about what goes on in the brain, about what the brain determines as a reward, the motivation to get that reward again, and everything that goes with it. So this definition says that addiction is about functioning, brain circuitry, and how the structure and function of the brains of persons with addiction differ fundamentally from the structure and function of the brains of persons who do not have addiction. It's not the same. Their chemical pathways, how things go, how it works and why it works is different. Lots of times in 12-step programs, there's sort of there's the term you hear about normies. About normies operate differently in a normie brain versus an addict brain, and it's panning out. That's for real. That takes place, and that's exactly what this ASAM definition is all about. The ASAM definition talks about reward circuitry in the brain and the related circuitry, but the emphasis is not on the external rewards that act on the reward system. It's about what's going on internally to the person. So within that definition, food, sexual behaviors, gambling can all be associated with a pathological pursuit of rewards described in this new definition of addiction. Just about everybody today is willing to say that gambling is a real addiction, that it takes place, that people have major problems. And everyone can recognize it as such. There's 12-step meetings just associated to Gamblers Anonymous. There's treatment specifically for that, about how to approach it differently than lots of other addictions. Gambling works just the same way in the brain as far as the circuitry, the reward systems, and the motivation systems as sexual behaviors do. What that means, why you pursue it, how and why you have to go after those things, and how it occurs within an addict's brain is the fundamental issue of what we're going after here. So on that level, if we can all look at and agree to that gambling is an addiction and operates in a very similar way to lots of other addictions. Now, we can't call it the same. Gambling can very much give you a sense of high and give you a sense of low, much the same way the drugs do. It's not to the same level. We can't pretend that. And so what the gambler high and what they feel is not the same thing as a cocaine high. The gambler low is not the same thing as what heroin does to the brain. However, it's going down the same path, and it It is the same systems. It's the same circuitry. It's the same chemistry that's going on that way. Such is also true for sexual behaviors and why you go after those and how you go after those and how it feels, if you will, in the brain. So this is taken from the ASAM, Frequently Asked Questions, and this is off of asam.org. So I'm going to read this to you. This is a big statement. We all have the brain reward circuitry that makes food and sex rewarding. We all have that. It's all in there. That's why we do those things. In fact, this is a survival mechanism. On the most basic, fundamental level, we as creatures, as mammals, we need to eat and we need to reproduce. In a healthy brain, these rewards have feedback mechanisms for satiety or enough. So what that means is, so in a normie's brain, if you will, or in a healthy brain, what happens is somewhere along the way, the brain goes, okay, that's enough. I don't need any more food. I don't need any more sex. I don't need any more gambling. That's enough right now, for whatever reasons, because you've had enough good or you've had enough bad that you don't want that anymore. In someone with an addiction, though, the circuitry becomes dysfunctional, such that the message to the individual becomes more, give me more, which leads to a pathological pursuit of rewards and or relief through the use of substances and behaviors. So anyone who has an addiction is vulnerable to food and sex addiction. That's a big statement. And so what that means is if I have a brain where instead of getting the enough, I get the give me some more, then all these different possible behaviors or substances are on the table of things that I could do. So it could be cocaine, it could be alcohol, it could be heroin, it could also be sex. And so what that means is I have a brain that is set up for these things. That satiety doesn't come in at the same points for lots of other people's brain. It's just set up that way. And so anyone who has an addiction to one of these things is vulnerable to one of those other things. And so often, just anecdotally, that's what most of us experience. For those of us who are working with people who have really severe drug addictions, there's lots of times other behavioral addictions that go there too. Even if they're being sober from one, they may not be being sober from another. I've had lots of clients who, while they're being sober from heroin, they're doing lots of binge behaviors. Or it could be a shopping binge, it could be a gambling binge, and it could be a sex binge. The reasons why they do it, also you'll see in there the pursuit of rewards, because it feels good to do those things. Quite obviously, to engage in sex feels really good physically. It also feels really good to your brain. And or the relief that you feel afterwards. And so lots of times it's a compensatory behavior. If I don't like myself, and I feel bad about myself, and I get triggered into those sets of thoughts, how do I make myself feel better? Lots of times through a drug-addicted person, they go and pursue the drugs. I go and drink myself into a blackout to make myself feel better because I just remember the abuse that took place from my father, for example. Well, that could absolutely be completely true for any other number of behavioral addictions. And so I could pursue sex. I could do promiscuous sex. I could do dangerous sex in order to compensate and feel relief over the bad thoughts or bad other things that just went on for me. And that's what the ACM is saying here. That's what the American Society of Addiction Medicine is saying in these statements, is that these things absolutely positively can run and do run similar to lots of other addictions. I'm going to just breeze through sort of the alcohol dependence, the diagnostic code. As we all know, the DSM-5 just came out. And there's some amount of tweaks and changes to here. I want to just look through this is for the alcohol dependence and what that means. And actually the term dependence has changed as well, as we know. But as just sort of a template for looking at if we can agree that alcohol is an addiction. We all agree that alcohol is an addiction. If we can look at this as far as these are the behaviors that go with someone with an alcohol addiction, then let's apply it to a sex addiction. Hang with me, it'll make sense. So alcohol dependence. So it's a maladaptive pattern of alcohol use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by a couple of the following. So what you need is there's an increased tolerance, and so you need more of it to feel as good as it did before. And each time you do it, you have a diminished effect. There's a withdrawal from it. If you stop doing it, you get withdrawal symptoms. or you do closely related drugs to relieve or avoid the withdrawal symptoms. Also within the alcohol dependence is alcohol is used in larger amounts over a longer period of time. There's a persistent use, or rather a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control. So like I've tried somewhere along the way to cut down, or I've tried somewhere to do less of it, or I really, really want to. Number 5 is a great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to get it, to use it, and to recover from it, so it becomes a dominant factor in your life. The important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of alcohol use. So I'm spending all this time to do those things. Now there's, so all these other things go away, such as my friends, or having fun, or my job. 7 is alcohol use is continued despite knowing that there's persistent or recurrent problems, physical or psychological, that have been caused or exacerbated by alcohol. So I keep doing it, knowing that it's caused problems in my life, physical problems, psychological problems, or other problems. I keep doing it even though. So if we look at, let me back up real fast. And so this is the diagnostic code. This is the old diagnostic code for alcohol dependence. So if we look at those, about all the things that go with it, and we're in agreement that alcohol is something you can have an addiction to, and I'm skipping back again. And if we can, and we're looking at the ASAM is saying that alcohol and sex and food all run through the same circuitry, then let's look at, if we can agree this is a problem, we can agree that alcohol and sex run through the same circuitry, and we have this definition, let's look at a potential definition for what a sex addiction could be. So Patrick Carnes, who's one of the leading experts in this field and has been on this for a very long period of time, very well-respected guy, this is the definitions that he's come up with to help look at this, and it's a great frame of reference to look at this. So you're going to find a lot of similarities to the alcohol addiction as to the sex addiction. And watch where we go. There's a recurrent failure or pattern to resist impulses to engage in the acts of sex. Patrick Carnes is also saying to look at frequently engaging in those behaviors to a greater extent over a longer period of time than intended. So that's, again, we're going very similarly to what the alcohol dependence looks like. There's also persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to stop, reduce, or control these behaviors. There's also an inordinate amount of time spent in obtaining sex, being sexual, or recovering from a sexual experience. Again, very, very similar to the alcohol dependence. And there's a preoccupation with the behavior or preparatory activities. So again, look at this. So there's a pattern that I want to resist the impulses, that I want to do less of it, but I can't stop myself from doing it, which is very similar to, look at this. Number 4, there's persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down and control alcohol use. Okay, now skipping forward to alcohol addiction, or sex addiction rather. You're frequently engaging in those behaviors to a greater extent over a longer period of time than is intended. So again, it's just like building up the tolerance. You need more of it to feel as good as you did before. Persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to stop, reduce, or control those behaviors. You want to, but you can't. Inordinate amount of time spending obtaining, being sexual, or recovering, just like the amount you increase the amount of time you're looking to alcohol, doing it or recovering from it. And then preoccupation with behavior or preparatory activities. This is a little bit different, and this is what a big marker of sexual addiction is. How much time you think about and set up for doing that thing. There's, for a sex addict, a lot of time is spent, there's a lot of importance of, and actually a lot of pleasure derived from the setup beforehand and what that looks like in the preparation around it. Patrick Carnes is also saying, as far as a definition for sexual addiction, frequently engaging in sexual behavior when expected to fulfill occupational, academic, domestic, or social obligations. So again, those other things in my life are going away as I spend more and more time needing and getting sex. Also, the continuation of a behavior despite knowing of having a persistent or recurrent social, academic, financial, psychological, or physical problem that is caused or exacerbated by the behavior. So I continue to do it even though there's major problems from it, just like we saw with the alcohol. Need to increase the intensity, frequency, number, or risk of behaviors to achieve the desired effect. Now, the risk of the behaviors to achieve the desired effect, that's a little different, obviously, than alcohol. But what is happening here with a sex addict is they do riskier and riskier behaviors because it feels better. You get more intense. You get more of a rush from if I could get caught while doing it. That could mean something like a public place, or what I'm looking at, or who I'm doing it with, or if I'm doing it through masturbation on the computer, like what sort of stuff, what sort of sites I'm going to, what computer I'm using. Potentially that's I'm going to do it at work because I'm getting more of a rush because I get caught doing it, stuff like that. With continued behaviors at the same level of intensity, frequency, or number, or risk. So again, I need more in order to make myself feel better about doing it. Giving up or limiting social, occupational, or recreational activities because of the behavior. Now, there's also, as with alcohol, the sex addiction, there's a big part of this that also has to do with shame. It's really generally accepted and generally looked at within popular culture that most other addictions we accept and are fine with. Being in 12-step is not, is not necessarily frowned upon for gambling addiction or a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction. However, a sex addiction, there's still a major stigma attached. And if you're a sex addict, you're not looked at the same as if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict. It doesn't carry the same way in pop culture or with the general population as with other addictions. And so there's this huge sense of shame and need to hide that goes with it at a different level than other addictions do. And last here is resorting to distress, anxiety, restlessness, or violence if unable to engage in the behavior at times relating to SRD, sexual rage disorder. I'm not going to go into totally what sexual rage disorder is. That's a whole other talk. But what that means is here is whenever I don't get to do those things, if I don't get to engage in the sex I want, when I want it, in the way that I want it, I get really angry. I get really distressed. I get really anxious, or I get really violent. When that happens, that lets you know how powerful it is and how much I needed to do it at the time. And when I don't, it comes out sort of sideways in these other behaviors. So I skip back real fast. So if we look at that definition of sexual addiction and what it means and how similar it is to alcohol addiction, that lines up really well with what the American Society of Addiction Medicine is saying around the brain circuitry and what it means and what we need to do as far as a potential definition. It operates really similarly, just as alcohol dependence does. I could have pulled any dependence out of the DSM. It lines up just the same way. And Patrick Carnes' definition here, as you're looking at, you can see that it's really similar. It lines up that same way. Because it is. This is a real addiction, and because it causes real problems for real people all the time. If we're looking at next, let's skip ahead. So men's brains, it's different. Quite obviously. It's a joke slide here. But it's also very similar to any of us who, as a male, that's, may or may not be my brain. The emphasis here, as I'm going to go into, is there's a real difference between male and female brains, especially as it pertains to sex. If we look into pornography and male chemistry, or chemistry in men's brains. So what happens is, for pornography and what it means for males is really interesting. Now, as a male is looking at pornography, and that may be through any number of means. That could be through computer, could be through video, could be through whatever. What happens is, in some major ways, it's just like it's happening. The brain kind of can't tell the difference. And as a male approaches orgasm, as males or females approaches orgasm, what happens is there's a series of chemicals that get released in the brain, and what that means for them is, and how it makes it much more likely and much easier for a male to get addicted to these things. Let me walk you through all this. So as a male is approaching orgasm, what happens is one of the chemicals that gets released is testosterone. The purpose of testosterone is to focus in. It provides more focus. So as a male is approaching orgasm, and as testosterone is getting released, I am focusing more and more on my partner as I'm trying to achieve orgasm. Now, this operates on a very basic sort of fundamental mammal level as reproduction. When a male has an orgasm, it allows him to spread his seed, if you will. It allows for more DNA, it allows it to propagate the species. That's the whole purpose. What is happening here, as far as male brain and chemistry, is I'm focusing in on my partner. Now, in this case, if I am having consensual sex with a partner, there's a real purpose for that. It allows me to focus in on what I'm doing and whom I'm with. If it's pornography, I am focusing on that partner. And that partner could be the person who I'm watching in this sexual movie or the sexual video or whatever's going on, or even just a sexual picture. Or it could be me focusing on the experience overall. Either way, I'm locking in and looking more and more and more like a funnel. I'm becoming less aware of my overall environment outside of me and just towards that sexual experience. And so in the beginning of that sexual experience, I may be aware of who's in the room next to me or what's going on outside of these doors or who might walk in. As I get closer and closer and testosterone gets released, I care less about those things. I'm just focusing on that experience and getting to that orgasm. And that's going on in males' brains. Another thing that gets released is endorphins. These are a lot like opiates. They create a feeling of well-being. They go down the same chemical pathways, and they operate in very similar ways to opiates. That feeling of well-being and feeling of good, and that gets released, and that's not just with orgasm, that's towards. And so I am focusing in on this sexual experience, and I'm feeling really good about it. Dopamine is also released during this time. And those are just like stimulants. They affect reward and reward-driven behaviors. And so now check this out about what's going on. So I'm really focused in on this. I'm going towards achieve an end, creating a feeling of well-being, and then there's this a reward-driven behavior. So it makes me want to do this more next time. The dopamine, my brain says, "Ooh, I like dopamine. Give me more dopamine. I want more dopamine." And so what's happening towards orgasm is the brain is saying, "I want this to happen more." There's also serotonin, and that's associated with feelings of well-being and happiness. This is all going towards climax for a male. Afterwards, what happens is there's a release of a chemical called oxytocin, and that's also called the love hormone. So afterwards, I've had this build up towards, I've focused in, my brain wants more of it, it feels very good to do it, and then afterwards this love hormone gets released. And so that bonds me to that experience afterwards. And so if this were operating in consensual sexual act with another partner, what happens is I become more bonded to that person that I just did it with. That's the whole purpose of it, to attach. We're pack animals, you know? And so then I get more attached to that person after I've had this experience with them. If I'm doing this with pornography, what happens is then I get attached to potentially that person in the pornography or that experience that I just happened with the pornography. And so I get attached to my computer or my DVD player or that TV and that experience that just went down that way. Also, the way it plays out is as I'm watching pornography, depending on how I place myself in that experience, my brain can't totally tell the difference between I'm watching it happen and it's happening to me. So it seems like the real thing. All of the chemicals that get released, let me skip back. The testosterone, the endorphins, the dopamine, and the serotonin get released in the same way with pornography as they do with having sex with a partner. It goes on just the same way. The orgasm is an orgasm as far as the brain is concerned. And so I get attached to, in the way that I should have been potentially attached to someone with whom I'm having sex, I get attached towards that masturbatory experience with pornography. And so what happens is there's all these great cues that I learned to attach with that experience. I've worked with so many sex addicts that have looked at pornography on the computer and what it means as far as the setup and where I go and how it goes. And so, for example, if I'm the sex addict and if I'm sneaking off, so let's say my wife is asleep and I'm sneaking off with the computer to go masturbate towards some pornography. Then the whole thing around sneaking out, her not noticing me, how that feels, the dark, the room I go into, and then that sound that happens when the computer gets turned on, and sort of the sound of that screen coming on, and then tapping the keys, all that setup, there's an attachment towards that whole process. And so we'll get into treatment later, but part of relapse prevention and what that looks into is very simply around the computer and the sound of the computer screen turning on, and or being on the internet and seeing, for example, like my Internet Explorer coming up, all those things because of this experience and when it's been bonded to, becomes all triggering stuff, and that's tough because if I'm looking at and kind of bonded to an experience around pornography around computers, most people have to do computers all day at work, one way or another. That's really tough. There's no way around those triggers. You can't be abstinent from those set of triggers. I'll get into that more. I just wanted to emphasize about that whole experience and what it means for them with pornography, and then how very much entrenched men can get with that based on just the chemicals getting released and the way that their brains are set up. So here's the sexual addiction cycle. So it's a cycle. So there's not exactly a beginning, if you will, because it's a cycle. So it just goes over and over and over again. But if we start at the top, it's going to start with a pain agent. Now, what that pain agent is could be any number of things. And that is whatever that person determines is a pain agent. That could be anything from some outward experience. I get yelled at by my boss. I get in a fight with my wife. I'm really stressed out, to something internal. I remember being molested. I have a flashback. I had a nightmare. Whatever it is, I'm determining it's something bad that hurts. From that, I'm going to experience emotional discomfort. Now, again, these are things that we all experience every day. We all have pain agents throughout the day. We all have emotional discomfort throughout the day. It happens to all of us all the time. What happens is I am unable to, though, resolve it in a reasonable way. So most of us, in most ways, most of the time, when I'm experiencing that discomfort, have ways that we deal with that. You can talk to somebody. You can do some deep breathing and calm yourself down. You go take a walk. You go work out. You go for a jog. Whatever it looks like, we all have ways that we reasonably cope with stuff. For someone with a sexual addiction, they don't. And it becomes this conflict where they can't resolve that discomfort. And so they may try things and it not work. They may not try things because they don't want it to work. What's happening at this point, though, is there's this feeling and it doesn't go away and it may get worse. That causes me stress. If I want it or don't want it to go away and it's not getting, and that conflict is increasing, that's a feeling of stress. And that's on top of now that emotional discomfort. Those two things are piling on top of each other in a very additive way. And so I've had this pain agent that may or may not still be going on. I'm experiencing the discomfort. Let's say I try to resolve it but can't. The stress then comes from that, and then from there it comes a need to connect. After that is dissociation, and I separate myself from my feelings. Now this is a key point. If I don't do this, then I stay connected to those feelings, and those feelings stink, and I don't want those feelings. I've tried to resolve them, but I can't. So what else have I learned how to do? Oh yeah, I learned how to separate myself from my feelings. Now this is an adaptive response. There's no judgment here. Everyone is always doing the best they can, given the resources they have in that moment. And so I've tried. I've tried in a reasonable way, as best I could figure out to do, to resolve the conflict, and I have it. And I'll have the stress and all the thoughts that may come with that. I can't tolerate that. I can't stay there. Something has to happen. So from there, I separate myself from my feelings. And that is, I make my feelings go away. I separate myself from it. I'm not feeling those. That's sort of a numbing that goes on. The altered state comes from there. Reality gets blocked out. From there, then, there's a series of decisions. And so I don't like those feelings that occurred before. I need to do something about it. I've dissociated away from it. I still can't stay in that state, though. I can't stay in that dissociated state and not like those feelings. So what do? I know how to make that feel better. That's where the sexual addiction comes in. From there, I start pursuing the behavior, moving towards acting out. And what that looks like is I'm going to think about it. I'm going to prep about it. I'm going to want to get towards it. I'm going to sort of think about maybe what side I'm going to go on to. If, sexual addiction can take many different courses, so potentially, if I'm going to go seek a prostitute or if I'm going to go have promiscuous sex, I'm going to start planning all of those things out. In planning those out, I'm going to start thinking about it. And again, like I said before, lots of times the setup feels just as good as doing it. And so I'm looking forward, and I've now compensated, at least partially, for those really bad feelings that I've had to separate myself from. From there, I then get into the behavior. And then after that, there's just a time until the cycle begins again. During that time, I may or may not feel guilty about it. In the beginning, lots of times, as that cycle is going, there's lots of times when I feel guilty about it, and I wish I didn't do it. As so many of us have experienced along the way, the more I do something, the less I feel bad about it. We've all had that lie that we've told a million times, so much so that it kind of seems like the truth at this point, and you don't even feel badly telling that lie anymore. That's what this is like, to a different level, of course. But it's that same thing. Like, you've done it so many times, the guilt may or may not be there. If you get caught, you may feel guilty. You may feel shame. If you did something different than you've done before, if it's something a little more extreme, if there's a risk towards it, like if I've started masturbating at work, looking at pornography to increase the risk so it feels a little bit better, I may feel guilty afterwards. But again, it might not. And then there's just some amount of time before the cycle begins again. If I'm not taking care and not looking at the reasons why this is going on, that time could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year, it could be years. And it may just happen to be like how life is just maybe lining up for me, that I haven't had a pain agent and I haven't gone back to it. Or it may be that something comes quickly. If something happens again tomorrow, I feel bad about it. I get in another argument, or my boss yells at me again, or I just experience whatever emotions that I don't like, and I experience discomfort from there, then I am back in my cycle. Okay, so how does a sex addict become a sex addict? Well, somewhere along the way, they have to learn that sex makes them feel better, and so they can compensate for those bad feelings through sex. Now, how do they find those things out? It could just be through curiosity. Excitement and pleasure. They're going to do it through self-medication. They can do it through dependency, replacement for intimacy, and then there's a sense of no way out. So what it means is that in the beginning, I could just get curious about this, and what does this feel like? Just through general experimentation that lots of us go through in our development. We get that there's lots of excitement and a lot of pleasure from it, and then from there, there's a big jump between 2 and 3. The excitement and pleasure towards making myself feel better about bad stuff. And that's what self-medication is, through lots of different addictions. I'm trying to make myself feel better through this behavior so that I don't have to feel other stuff. I then become dependent on it as I limit how I'm able to cope with situations, what's on the buffet of all the different ways I can cope and make myself feel better. I become more and more dependent on seeking sex as a way to make myself feel better. From there, it becomes a replacement for intimacy. And that, again, that takes a couple of different reasons why. It might just be through I have no other outlet. It also could be through I don't want other intimacy because I don't want this to go away. If I become bonded to this experience of masturbation or this experience of whatever potential sexual addiction I have, then intimacy may or may not have a place there. Lots of times it's going to get in the way. If I'm close with people, they're going to know what's going on for me. If they know what's going on for me, they want to stop it. I can't have relationships then because they're going to get in the way. And then the last part is feeling like there's just no way out. You're just stuck. If I'm dependent on it and I don't have people close to me, then there's no way out, and that's all I have, which is going to make you feel worse, which is going to increase your need to have to do this to make yourself feel better.
Hello, this is Sylvia.
Hey, Sylvia, it's Dr. Marianne.
Hi.
Yeah,
I want to look now towards the big difference between between sex addicts
Perfect. I'll see you
and
then.
sexual offenders.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So let's look at the sex offense cycle. I'm going to skip back here a couple. Here's a sexual addiction cycle. There are some amount of things that are the same towards the sex offense cycle, but you're going to notice some major differences. Let's go through that. So at the top's an events. So again, these are things that happen in your life. They're going to make you feel hopeless, helpless, worthless. That's very similar to the pain agent that took place before. But these are the feelings that you don't like that happen. And again, it could be something external that happens to you. It could be something internal, like a dream, a memory, just something coming up. Early in a sex offender's life, there's a big event or events that took place. It's not necessarily true that a sex offender had been sexually molested, but there's some sort of trauma that goes on. Something that took place that set them off balance, that sort of set the original, this original cycle in motion. What happens is after that event comes up, something that happens to make you feel hopeless, helpless, and worthless. From there, what happens with the offender is they then get into a victim stance. Victim stance is where I'm feeling really bad for myself based on the bad things that happened to me. They're feeling it in a very sort of poor me kind of situation. And from there comes negative anticipation. Negative anticipation means I'm expecting those bad things to go on over and over and over again. So if in early life, let's say that my dad was physically abusing me. Those are the original events. Now, of course, physical abuse from your dad is going to make you feel hopeless, helpless, and worthless. That's what goes on so much. From there, I'm going to feel badly for myself, and then I'm going to expect that to go on all the time. So every time I come home from school, or every time I go to bed at night, or every time I see my dad, I'm going to begin to expect him to hit me or physically abuse me or to feel bad. From there becomes emotional isolation. I feel like I'm the only person in the world that has that's happening to, and they may be directly through what the offender is doing to me. So if it's my dad who is physically abusing me, and, he's going to tell me not to say anything to anybody or to lie about it, and I'm going to feel really alone there. I'm going to feel like I'm just stuck with my own emotions and I can't connect to anybody. Now, what happens for an offender between the emotional isolation and then there's a big leap to a need for power. So what's happening is in my life, I'm feeling powerless through those early events. I'm feeling hopeless, helpless, worthless. I then come to correlate that I feel powerless, so I need power and I need to take power back. From there, then, I get into obtaining power through sex. Now, very similarly to how to a sex addict, somewhere along the way, I'll have to come to figure out that sex makes you feel better. For an offender, it's that sex makes me feel powerful. Now, how they come across that, there's any number of potential ways. And it could be through I viewed pornography. It could be through I was molested. So I came to figure out that, hey, if I was molested and I feel powerless, then if I molest somebody else, then I'm going to feel powerful. It could be that I saw my parents, they would get in really big fights, and then they would have sex afterwards. Let's say my mom was potentially promiscuous, and I saw her have lots of sexual partners. There's any number of these ways, but somewhere along the way, I came to figure out that sex and power go together. I feel powerless, so I'm going to take some sex. From there, what happens is there's a process for a sex offender, and they start to cruise and groom, which means they're looking for their potential victims. This process could be minutes. This process could take days. This process could take weeks. They're looking for someone with whom they could act out. Maybe someone close to them, and maybe someone who they don't know, but they're looking for the right situation, the right person. Once they figure that out, then they're going to groom that victim, and that means they're going to get the victim ready. They're going to break down physical boundaries for that victim. And so if I'm thinking about molesting someone, I need to know that it's going to be okay because I don't want to get caught doing that. And so from there, I'm going to start doing small things to break down boundaries. That's stuff like tickling or wrestling or other stuff, so they get more and more used to that. I may show them some pornography. I may talk openly about sex with them, stuff like that. I'm also going to groom the people around them. I need my victim to be isolated away from the people who could stop it or to whom the victim could turn. I'm also going to groom myself at a real basic fundamental level. Sexually offending on someone is against everyone's moral code. And so I'm breaking my own moral code. And so as I'm doing that, I kind of have to get myself used to doing these things more and more. From there, it becomes the justifications. Like, I'm going to tell myself the reasons why it's okay to do this. Now, they're not okay reasons, but what I'm telling myself makes it okay enough in my head to get to do it. And then there's eventually a decision to act. I tell myself that I'm going to do it, and I get to the point of no return where it's gonna happen. After that, I sexually act out. I'm going to do those things that I have thought about doing with the person I've thought about doing them with. After that is some transitory guilt. So let's assume the person isn't a sociopath. Assume the person isn't a psychopath, and they have a sense of potentiality for guilt here, and they do have a sense of moral code and right and wrong. That same reason why I needed to groom myself and have justifications for doing it, because I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, I'm going to feel guilty for doing it afterwards. Now again, the 100th time I've done this, I'm going to feel not that guilty. The first time I've done it, I'm going to feel very, very guilty. From there, there's going to be some amount of compensation for what I've just done. And that may be a couple of different ways. Let's say I molested my younger sister. That was my sexual offense. My compensation then may be like, I'm going to be the best brother on the face of the earth to her. So I'm going to do all these things, like I'm going to get her gifts, I'm going to help her with her chores, I'm going to be really, really nice to her, I'm going to be the best son in the world, I'm going to do all these nice things for my parents, I'm going to make it look like I'm someone who would never do things like that. Because I feel bad. And so just like, whenever you've hurt someone and you feel bad for hurting them, you go out of your way to then compensate for it so they don't feel bad anymore. It's the same kind of thing. That's what I'm going to do. After that comes reconstitution. Reconstitution in the sex offense cycle means I have to make sense of what I just did. I just did those things. What do I tell myself? How do I make sense out of it? Where do I go from here? And so that's the part where I'm sort of piecing myself back together after doing those things. Because I felt guilty and because I did it. And then the cycle repeats. Again, there's going to be events that come up. I feel bad about myself. I feel hopeless, helpless, and worthless. I feel emotionally alone. And I still need power. I'm still going to attain power through sex. And then it can just repeat. Now, you're going to notice, so I'm going to skip back a little bit. There are some real similarities to the sexual addiction cycle. But there's major, major differences. The need to get power through sex, the need to hurt someone, wanting to take power away from someone in order to make myself feel better is very, very different than going back to I'm going to act out in the behavior that makes me feel better through masturbation or through sexually acting out with someone in a consensual way. Through lots of times sex addicts will pursue it through like a prostitute, or they'll act out with somebody in a promiscuous way, but it's consensual. Both are consenting people. Sexual offenders, there's inherent non-consent. I am taking someone from somebody to make myself feel better. It's not the same thing. A sex offender might be a sex addict. Usually not. They don't necessarily go together. A sex addict is very, very rarely a sex offender. Those two things don't necessarily go together. This is an important distinction. Lots of times in popular ideas and what most people tend to think is that sex offenders and sex addicts are the same kind of people. They're not. A sex offender is someone who wants to hurt somebody through sex to take power to make myself feel better. Skipping back again. That is not what's going on through sex for a sex addict. That's not what they're looking for. They're trying to make themselves feel better, but through a very different means. Let's get into treatment. So the treatment for sex addicts. So here's what we know. This is coming out of what we know creates change. So the major variables here. This is from Duncan and Miller and their work, the work around what they know and their research around what creates change for people. So here's what we got broken down. 50% of it comes from hope. And so does the client hope for and do they believe that change can take place? 40% comes from client variables. That's who the client is, what they have going on in their life, how they come into treatment, stuff that's specific to the client. 30% then, this is a whole 30%, comes from therapeutic relationship. That's essentially rapport. Does the client believe that you are someone who can help them change? Do you believe that you are someone who can help them change? And do they feel bonded and connected to you? And the last 15% is listed here as technique. Are you doing the technique that is known to help out and it makes sense? Lots of times there is potentially the wrong answer. Now there's big meta-analyses. If we look at just drug and alcohol treatments, the big meta-analyses at this point say that just about everything works as well as just about everything else. That's what clearly they're finding. There are ones that make more sense for the clients. There's ones that make less sense for clients, for each individual client. But we know that just about everything works. What are going to be the big differences here then and what you can do is what makes sense for you, what makes sense for the client, and do you have a therapeutic relationship with them? Let me drill down a little bit. So based on that, if we look at the work of Duncan and Miller, treatment needs to focus on rapport development. 30% of change is coming from are they connected to you? You're going to have to look at mutually agreed upon goals and objectives. So that's the client and I are agreeing on where we're headed and how we're getting there. The metaphor I use for my clients is I'm going to let you come up with the big goals. You can set where we're going, but then I'm going to be MapQuest, and I'm going to figure out the routes we can take there. And I'll give you a couple options. I'll give you Route 1, I'll give you Route 2, I'll give you Route 3, and you can pick which ones, but I'm going to come up on which streets and roads we're taking to get to where you want to go. If they're in my office, if they're in my program and we're talking about they want to, the goals they want to work on is sexual addiction and getting through their sexual addiction, that's great. Let's talk about how it's going to break down, and I'm going to help break down those streets, whether we're taking the highway or the side streets, if you will, to get there. Treatment also needs to focus on psychoeducation about sexual addiction and the treatment process. We know that we have to educate them that this is real. Sexual addiction, like I said before, has huge stigma attached to it. So I want to let them know that this is okay, that there's lots of people that suffer from this. There's lots of people out there. No, it's way more underground than lots of other addictions, but that doesn't mean that there's not lots of people going through it. I want to help normalize this. I want to help let them know that they're not alone in this. And I want to let them know what that treatment process is going to look like along the way. So they know that here's where we are, and here's where we're going, and here's what that process is going to look like, and here's how long it might take, and here's what you're processing this. When we look at that original ASAM criteria and what they came up with, it is a chronic disease. That means this goes on and on and on. That means the treatment for this isn't going to be quick. It may take years to get through everything that needs to be gotten through here to get them to a point of sobriety, if you will, for the sexual addiction. Treatment also needs to focus on the triggers and urges that lead to acting out. We have to help them look at and figure out what's starting that process. So when we looked at that sexual addiction cycle, it started with a pain agent. They may or may not be aware of what the pain agents are. What's setting that original process in place. So allowing them to see that and focus on that, be able to predict it and know it, and then head that off before it gets rolling too far. And then the urges. What brings up the urges? Where they are in the process, and what is the too far point where they can't turn around anymore? That if they've gotten that far, they're going to act out. So we need to figure out and help them figure out what to do, when, and how before they get there. Number 5 is helping them put tools in their toolbox, both skills of distraction and skills of mastery. Okay, so here's what those two mean. So skills of distraction are very simply, so in the beginning, as I'm figuring out what my triggers are, when I realize that I've just had a trigger, and I know that if I keep going down just the path that I'm going on right now, that if I keep going that way, I'm going to be in trouble. What skills of distraction are very simply those things that are going to move my attention from what they're on onto something else. We're going to work on a very basic brain chemistry level as far as if I'm triggered. So let's say the triggers are turning on my computer, and that gets me to, oh my gosh, I really want to act out right now. I need distracted away from that. What's going to help me do that? That may be, again, getting up, taking a walk, just getting out of the office, going and talking to somebody else, making a phone call, whatever that looks like that's going to get me out of that state into another state. I'm just looking for state change at this point. I just want to move them away from that. If it's a deep breathing exercise, I don't. For some people, it's whatever their hobbies are. Go play a game, go do some knitting, go do whatever it looks like for you. Get out of that state, get into a different state. Skills of mastery are those things that I can do to calm myself and calm down my system overall. So I've just got, I've had this urge, had this trigger, I've had this urge, I get myself distracted, okay, I'm in a different state. Now, the skills of mastery are those things that I can do to calm myself down. So those are like deep breathing exercises, mindfulness, meditation, those things overall that allow for trait changes, that allow me to be a bigger person, not a bigger person, a different person on that basic chemical level, so that I'm not so easily triggered. Those are also the things that I do that make me feel good about myself. So that I can have different thoughts about myself overall, that I'm not just a sex addict, that I'm something else too. They're also going to have to have a relationship with healthy sexuality. Sex is not something that overall you want a person to be necessarily abstinent from forever. Now, in the beginning of treatment, abstinence is very likely necessary, and that is all forms of abstinence, and that's going to include masturbation. How long, that's debatable, and the literature is all over the place at this point. There's lots of times it's 90 days, and lots of times it's up to 6 months, where you need to abstain overall from any sexual activity, and that can be consensual with my wife to masturbation, which is just activity with myself. Eventually, though, I have to get back to having a relationship with healthy sexuality, and they need to know that. So as I'm defining for them what that looks like in the beginning, where we're going to and explaining the treatment process, one of the last steps in that is getting back to having healthy sexuality. It's a bonding experience. If I'm someone who wants to have an emotional relationship with a partner, sex is physicality is a natural extension from that. And we want that in their lives. We just want it in a healthy way. We're going to assess and work with motivation to address the memories, emotions, and belief systems. Secondary gains are really tough to give up. So it's one thing. So I don't want to just, I'm going to need to address, like, you know, I was doing those behaviors, I was doing sexual behaviors because they were compensatory to make me feel better. Also, having sex just feels good. And so it's tough to just give up that just giving good part. And so even when I no longer need to compensate for it, there's still those parts where it just feels good to my body and it feels really good to my brain, and I want to continue them just for the sake of that. And number 6 here is processing underlying traumatic memories. We're going to look at and have to be able to delve into what set us off balance to begin with. And so as we looked in the beginning about the pain agent, about what those things are, if there's underlying trauma there, or I have stuff in my past that I haven't taken care of, if I have unfinished business, that I am going to be really predisposed to compensate in unbalanced ways again in the future. There's lots of different ways to do that. There's trauma-focused CBT works really well with that. The research is great on that with adolescents, EMDR. has really good research behind it. There's other ways of doing it as far as psychodrama or thought field therapy or any number of these things that are great ways to look at trauma. We know that lots of times with people with addictions, and especially sexual addictions, there's underlying trauma there that needs to be resolved, and if it's not, they're going to be off balance again in the future. Here's the big takeaways, and here's what we covered. The sexual addiction is similar to other types of addictions. We went through the ASAM criteria about how it's a brain chemistry issue, and we compared about how alcohol dependence definition is very similar to Patrick Carnes' definition of sexual addiction, and how those things are very similar that way. We also talked about and looked into that sexual addiction is different from other types of addictions, that it operates in different ways, about the increase in need for risk or how it goes and how it operates in the brain is not the same. That male brain chemistry plays a really key part in all of this, and how it works for males, testosterone and endorphins and dopamine and oxytocin and what that means for them, and the need to repeat, especially in regard to pornography. That sex addicts are not sex offenders. It's not the same thing. And then we looked at sex addiction is really treatable when addressed properly and in the right ways. And as we looked at, rapport is there. And we take on all the different aspects, including looking at and attending to any underlying trauma. That is absolutely that people can have a healthy, balanced life after looking at and engaging in sexual addiction, sometimes for very long periods of time. That's my contact information. If anybody has any questions, you can absolutely feel free to forward those to me. That's my email. Easy to reach me there. Also, you see there at the phone number at the bottom, that's the general phone number for the Rosewood Tempe outpatient clinic. I am happy to field any phone calls or any emails along the way. Thank you very much, and I'm going to tag back into Nancy.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate your time. Just want to let everyone know that immediately following this webinar, you're going to receive an email with an evaluation and post-test attached. We ask that you complete both forms and return to tri@rosewoodranch.com. Upon successful completion, a score of 80% or better, and receipt of the post-test and evaluation, a CE certificate will be emailed to you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for questions, but as Mike said, he'll take your questions, and or if you want to send them to tri@rosewoodranch.com, we will definitely be able to get those to Mike, and he will answer them for us. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we hope you have a great day. I am going to leave the screen open for just a few moments with the tri@rosewoodranch.com address. And if you want information, additional information, about the Rosewood Institute, you may visit us at www.rosewoodinstitute.org. Thank you and have a great day.